The cruelest thing a person can do is decide someone else's future doesn't matter. The words would come years later, but on that night, inside a ballroom glowing with chandeliers and polished marble, no one yet understood how deeply those words would cut. The annual Grant Industries Winter Gala unfolded beneath a ceiling of crystal lights that shimmered like frozen stars, casting soft reflections across rows of round tables dressed in ivory linen and silver centerpieces. Waiters moved quietly between guests carrying trays of sparkling drinks while a string quartet played near the stage, their music floating gently above the low hum of conversation. Outside, Manhattan's January air hovered around 30 degrees, the kind of cold that turned every breath into fog. But inside the ballroom, the warmth of wealth and reputation wrapped around the room like velvet. Cameras flashed along the red carpet entrance, capturing the city's most influential investors, executives, and social figures arriving in tailored suits and elegant gowns. Tonight was not just a celebration of success. It was a celebration of Alexander Grant. At 38, Alexander had built Grant Industries into one of the fastest-growing logistics companies in North America. Business magazines called him brilliant, relentless, unstoppable. His face had appeared on the cover of Forbes only 3 months earlier beneath a headline that read "The Man Who Moves the World." Tall, composed, with sharp blue eyes that rarely revealed emotion, Alexander had a way of walking into a room that made people straighten their posture without realizing it. And tonight, every eye in the ballroom seemed to follow him as he moved through the crowd, shaking hands with board members and donors, his black tuxedo perfectly fitted, his calm confidence unmistakable. But just a few steps behind him stood the woman who had known him long before the cameras, long before the headlines, long before the world decided he was untouchable. Naomi Carter stood near the edge of the stage holding a small glass of water, her fingers wrapped around it, as if the cool surface could steady the storm building quietly in her chest. She wore a deep navy dress that caught the light with every movement, its simple elegance matching the quiet strength in her posture. Her dark curls rested gently along her shoulders, and though the room buzzed with attention around her, Naomi's focus was fixed on one thing alone: the moment she had waited weeks to find. From where she stood, she could see Alexander greeting another group of investors near the podium, his smile measured, his tone confident as he spoke about expansion, innovation, and the future of American logistics. The words sounded powerful to the crowd, but to Naomi they sounded distant, hollow, because tonight she carried a truth that would change everything. Beneath the smooth fabric of her dress, hidden from the crowd and the cameras, her hand slowly rested against her stomach. The gesture was subtle, instinctive, almost protective. Only 6 weeks earlier, in a quiet doctor's office on the Upper East Side, she had watched the tiny flicker appear on a black and white ultrasound screen. The technician had smiled gently and said the words Naomi had once feared she might never hear. "Congratulations. You're going to be a mother." Naomi had walked out of that clinic into the cold New York morning with tears in her eyes and sunlight spilling across the sidewalks, her heart pounding with equal parts joy and uncertainty. She had imagined this moment many times since then, telling Alexander, watching his serious expression soften, seeing the guarded man she loved finally allow himself to feel something bigger than business deals and quarterly reports. For 3 years they had built a life together inside the glass walls of his Manhattan penthouse, a life that rarely slowed down long enough for quiet dreams. But Naomi believed this news might finally give them something more permanent than success, something human. Across the ballroom, the music shifted as the quartet finished a piece, and the room slowly quieted while Alexander stepped toward the microphone at the center of the stage. The spotlight followed him, bright and steady, illuminating the polished confidence in his posture. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and controlled, carrying easily through the room. "Tonight isn't just about celebrating what Grant Industries has accomplished this year. It's about recognizing the people who made it possible." Applause rolled through the ballroom as he spoke about partnerships, innovation, and the future of the company. Naomi listened quietly, her heartbeat echoing in her ears louder than the applause. She knew the speech almost by memory. Alexander had practiced it twice in their living room the night before, pacing slowly across the hardwood floor while adjusting the wording with careful precision. Back then, she had nearly told him, But the moment never felt right. Tonight would be different. Tonight the room was filled with people who respected him, admired him, trusted his leadership. Naomi believed sharing the news here, surrounded by celebration, might make it easier for him to see it as a blessing instead of a complication. The speech ended with another wave of applause, and the room began to relax again as servers returned to the tables with fresh glasses and small plates. Alexander stepped down from the stage, immediately surrounded by board members offering congratulations. Naomi waited until the circle of executives thinned slightly before walking toward him, her steps calm but deliberate across the marble floor. The closer she moved, the louder the sound of her own heartbeat became. Alexander noticed her approach before she spoke. His eyes softened briefly, the way they always did when he saw her in a crowded room. "Naomi," he said quietly, leaning closer so the others wouldn't hear over the music beginning again behind them. "You're enjoying the evening?" She nodded, her lips forming a small smile. "It's beautiful." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the noise of the ballroom fading into the background like distant traffic. Naomi inhaled slowly. This was the moment she had been waiting for. "Alexander," she said softly, her voice steady but warm. "There's something I need to tell you." He tilted his head slightly, curiosity flickering across his face. "Is everything okay?" Naomi glanced around the room once, at the chandeliers glowing above them and the hundreds of guests laughing and talking only a few feet away. Then her hand moved again, resting gently over her stomach. The gesture was small, quiet, but it carried the weight of a future neither of them had expected. She met his eyes and said the words that had lived in her heart for weeks. "We're going to have a baby." For a moment Alexander didn't move. The sounds of the ballroom seemed to stretch into a strange silence between them, as if the world had paused to hear his response. Naomi searched his face, waiting for surprise, confusion, maybe even joy. Instead, she watched something else appear. Not excitement, not wonder, something colder. His jaw tightened slightly, the warmth fading from his expression like light leaving a room at sunset. "Naomi," he said quietly, his voice suddenly measured, careful in a way that made her chest tighten. "This isn't the time for jokes." Her smile faded instantly. "I'm not joking." He looked at her for several seconds, as if calculating a problem that didn't fit neatly into a business plan. The crowd continued to celebrate around them, unaware that something fragile had just cracked in the center of the room. Naomi felt the air shift between them, subtle but unmistakable. Alexander exhaled slowly and glanced across the ballroom toward the investors still watching him from their tables. When he spoke again, his voice carried the calm authority he used during negotiations, but there was no warmth left in it. "A child," he said quietly, almost to himself, "is not part of the future I've built." The words landed softly, but the meaning behind them felt heavier than the marble floor beneath Naomi's feet. And in that moment, beneath the crystal lights of the gala and the quiet music drifting through the room, Naomi Carter realized the man she loved was already preparing to walk away from the life growing inside her. The music from the string quartet drifted back into the air like nothing had changed, but for Naomi Carter the entire ballroom suddenly felt colder than the January wind outside. Alexander Grant stood only a few feet away from her, his posture still perfectly straight, his tuxedo immaculate, his face calm in the way that had once impressed investors and reporters alike. Yet the calm no longer felt reassuring. It felt distant, like a glass wall had quietly slid between them. Naomi searched his expression, hoping she had misunderstood the tone in his voice, hoping the moment was simply shock that would pass in a few seconds. Instead, Alexander glanced across the ballroom again, scanning the room the way a captain checks the horizon before a storm. Executives were watching him from several tables. A photographer near the stage raised a camera again. The evening was still centered around him, and Alexander Grant had never been a man who allowed his image to fracture in public. He leaned slightly closer to Naomi so that his words would remain private. "When did you find out?" he asked quietly. Naomi swallowed and kept her voice steady. 6 weeks ago." Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with the focused calculation of someone evaluating a business risk. "And you chose tonight to tell me." Naomi shook her head softly. "I chose tonight because I thought you would be happy." The answer lingered between them for a moment that felt longer than the entire speech he had given earlier. Across the room, laughter rose from one of the investor tables. Glasses clinked together. The gala continued as if the world had not shifted beneath Naomi's feet. Alexander inhaled slowly, his gaze lowering briefly toward her hand resting against her stomach. The movement was small, but it carried a quiet certainty that this was real. When he looked back at her, his expression had hardened into the composed mask Naomi had seen during difficult negotiations. "Naomi," he said carefully, "you should have spoken with me before making assumptions." Her chest tightened at the word assumptions. "This is not an assumption. This is our child." He did not respond immediately. Instead, he glanced again toward the tables of board members who were beginning to stand and mingle again as the evening program moved forward. For a man like Alexander Grant, every conversation had context, timing, and consequence. And to him, this conversation had arrived at the worst possible moment. "You know the position I am in right now," he said quietly. "Grant Industries is entering the most critical expansion phase in its history. Investors are watching every move I make." Naomi felt a faint disbelief rise in her chest. "This is not about investors. This is about our family." The word family seemed to land somewhere Alexander did not want it to. His jaw tightened slightly. "It is exactly about investors," he replied in a tone so controlled it almost sounded gentle. "Everything I build depends on stability and clarity. A child changes the structure of that stability." Naomi stared at him, struggling to connect the man in front of her with the one who had once stayed up late with her on their apartment balcony talking about the future while the city lights shimmered below them. Back then Alexander had spoken about building something meaningful, something lasting. She had believed she was part of that vision. "A baby is not instability," she said quietly. "It is life." Alexander exhaled slowly, as though he were preparing to deliver a difficult piece of news during a board meeting. "It is responsibility," he corrected. "And responsibility requires timing." Naomi felt the words settle into her chest like cold rain. "You are saying this is bad timing. I am saying this is not part of the plan." The music swelled slightly as the quartet began another piece, the melody soft but persistent. Naomi barely heard it. Her attention was fixed on the man standing in front of her, who now seemed farther away than strangers across the room. "Plans change," she said. "That is how life works." Alexander shook his head faintly. "Not when the stakes are this high." She could see the logic moving behind his eyes the same way it did when he negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He was not reacting emotionally. He was calculating outcomes. Naomi felt something inside her chest begin to crack. "You are talking about this like it is a business problem. Because every decision in my life affects the business." "This is not a decision," she whispered. "It has already happened." For the first time Alexander's composure faltered slightly. A shadow of frustration flickered across his face before he quickly controlled it again. "Then we need to handle it responsibly." Naomi frowned. "Handle it." His voice lowered even further, almost lost beneath the music. "You should consider all options." The meaning behind the words was clear even though he did not say it directly. Naomi's hand tightened instinctively against her stomach. "No." The response came immediately, steady and firm. Alexander studied her face, as if measuring whether she truly understood the consequences of the choice she had just made. "You are reacting emotionally," he said quietly. "That is understandable. But you need to think about what this means." Naomi's eyes glistened under the chandelier light, but she did not look away. "I have thought about it every day since the doctor told me." Alexander's gaze moved past her briefly toward the ballroom entrance where more guests were arriving, their laughter echoing against the marble walls. He seemed to gather his thoughts again before speaking. "Naomi, if this becomes public right now, it changes everything. Investors will question my judgment. Competitors will use it against us. The board will want explanations." She stared at him in disbelief. "You are worried about headlines. I am worried about consequences." "For you," she said quietly. Alexander did not answer. His silence felt louder than the orchestra. Naomi suddenly understood something she had not allowed herself to see before. Alexander was not afraid of becoming a father. He was afraid of losing control. The future he had built in his mind had no space for surprises. And a child was the most unpredictable thing in the world. "You want me to get rid of it," she said slowly. The words sounded strange in her own voice. Alexander did not repeat the suggestion directly, but his silence confirmed it. Naomi felt the room tilt slightly, though she remained standing perfectly still beneath the bright lights. Around them the gala continued with effortless elegance. Waiters refilled glasses. Investors exchanged business cards. Someone near the stage began applauding another speech that had just started. Life moved forward for everyone else in the room. But Naomi Carter felt as though she had stepped into a quiet space where only two futures existed. One path followed Alexander Grant's carefully designed world of strategy and reputation. The other followed the small heartbeat she had seen flicker on a screen 6 weeks earlier. She already knew which one she would choose. When she looked at Alexander again, her expression had changed. The softness he once loved in her eyes was still there, but it was now anchored by something stronger. "I am not ending this life," she said calmly. Alexander's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Then you are forcing a situation neither of us planned for." Naomi shook her head slowly. "No, I am accepting the one that already exists." He watched her for several seconds, and in those seconds the distance between them became undeniable. Finally Alexander spoke again, his voice quiet but decisive. "If you continue with this, Naomi, it will change our relationship completely." She held his gaze. "It already has." The words settled between them like a final line in a contract that neither of them had intended to sign. For several seconds neither of them moved. The music from the quartet continued drifting through the ballroom, soft and elegant, the kind of music meant to accompany celebration and success. But the quiet space between Naomi Carter and Alexander Grant felt heavier than the marble floor beneath their feet. Naomi stood beneath the chandelier light with her hand resting gently against her stomach, the small gesture instinctive now, protective in a way she had not fully understood until this moment. Across from her Alexander remained composed, his posture straight, his expression carefully neutral, yet the silence around him carried a decision that had already begun forming in his mind. A group of investors nearby laughed at something someone said, their voices echoing briefly across the room before fading again into the music. The world continued moving as if nothing important had happened. Alexander finally spoke, his voice controlled and quiet. "We cannot resolve this here." Naomi did not move. "There is nothing to resolve." His gaze hardened slightly. "There is always something to resolve." The phrasing sounded like a line from one of his business meetings, the kind that ended with contracts signed and problems eliminated. Naomi felt a faint ache rise in her chest at how easily he had shifted into that tone. She remembered the early days when Alexander had laughed more easily, when success was still a goal rather than an empire he protected like a fortress. "You believe everything can be negotiated," she said softly. "Because most things can." Naomi shook her head slowly. "A child is not a negotiation." Alexander glanced briefly toward the stage where another executive had begun speaking to the crowd. Applause rippled through the ballroom again. He leaned slightly closer to Naomi, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Then we should discuss this somewhere private, where we can speak clearly." Naomi studied him for a moment before answering. "We already are speaking clearly." His jaw tightened slightly. "Naomi." The way he said her name carried a quiet warning, the same tone he used when meetings were slipping out of his control. Naomi noticed the change and felt something settle inside her mind with surprising calm. For weeks, she had imagined how this moment might unfold. She had pictured Alexander taking her hands, asking questions, maybe even smiling in that rare way that softened his entire face. But the man standing in front of her was not the version she had imagined. He was the version the world admired. The CEO who managed outcomes. The strategist who removed uncertainty. And she now understood that uncertainty was exactly what frightened him. "You should not be worried about how this looks to other people," she said quietly. Alexander's eyes flicked toward the tables again, instinctively measuring who might be watching them. "Everything I do is watched by other people." Naomi let out a faint breath. "Then maybe they should see the real part of your life too." The words lingered in the air. Alexander looked at her as if she had suggested something completely unreasonable. "My personal life is not a public display." "But your reputation is," she replied gently. For a moment the silence between them deepened. The sound of silverware and quiet conversation filled the background like distant waves. Alexander finally straightened slightly, as if returning to the role he understood best. "You are asking me to risk everything I have built." Naomi blinked slowly. "No, I am asking you to recognize the life we created together." His expression remained unchanged. "And I am telling you that life will affect far more than just the two of us." Naomi could hear the certainty in his voice now, the kind that rarely changed once he had reached a conclusion. It was the same certainty that had helped him close billion-dollar partnerships and dominate competitive markets. But tonight it was being used for something else. Naomi felt the truth settle quietly inside her heart. Alexander had already chosen his priority. She lowered her gaze briefly toward the polished marble floor before looking back at him. "I thought you would be happy," she said softly. Alexander did not answer immediately. The flicker of emotion that crossed his face was brief and difficult to interpret. Perhaps it was frustration. Perhaps it was disappointment. Or perhaps it was simply the weight of a future he had not planned. "Happiness," he said finally, "does not change reality." Naomi felt a faint smile appear on her lips, though it carried no joy. Sometimes it should. He studied her expression, as if noticing that something fundamental had shifted in her tone. Naomi no longer looked uncertain or hopeful. She looked steady, grounded in a decision she had already made. The realization seemed to confirm something in his mind. Alexander's voice became even calmer. "If you continue with this choice, Naomi, it means our paths will separate." The words were not loud. They did not carry anger or accusation, but they landed with unmistakable clarity. Naomi's heartbeat slowed as she absorbed the meaning behind them. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to remember the first time she had met Alexander Grant. It had been at a charity event not unlike this one, though far smaller and far less glamorous. He had been ambitious then, driven but still human, in ways that made people feel close to him. She had believed she understood him. Now she realized she had only understood the version of him that existed before success hardened his world into strict boundaries. She met his gaze again. "You are saying that if I keep this baby, you will walk away." Alexander did not hesitate. "Yes." The word hovered between them, simple and precise. Naomi felt the weight of it, yet it did not break her the way she once feared it might. Instead, it clarified everything. The music swelled slightly again as the quartet transitioned into another melody. Somewhere behind them, a photographer's camera flashed briefly. Naomi realized that in a room full of hundreds of people, no one truly understood what was happening here. They only saw two elegantly dressed individuals speaking quietly near the center of the ballroom. But for Naomi Carter, the future had just been divided into two directions. One direction led back toward the life she had built beside Alexander Grant, a life defined by luxury, influence, and a carefully structured future. The other direction led toward uncertainty, responsibility, and a child who had not yet taken a first breath. Yet the choice did not feel uncertain at all. Naomi lifted her chin slightly, her posture steady beneath the chandelier light. "Then you should walk away now," she said calmly. Alexander's eyes narrowed faintly, surprised by the certainty in her voice. Naomi's gaze did not waver. "Because this child is not leaving." The quiet confidence in her words hung in the air like a final note in a song that had already reached its ending. Around them, the gala continued with effortless elegance, the city's most powerful figures discussing deals and investments beneath the glow of crystal lights. But inside that crowded ballroom, Naomi Carter had just stepped into a future that no one else in the room could yet see. The silence after Naomi Carter's final words felt deeper than the music drifting through the ballroom. Alexander Grant stood perfectly still beneath the chandelier light, his expression unreadable for several seconds as the weight of her decision settled into the space between them. Around them, the evening continued with effortless elegance. Crystal glasses clinked softly. Laughter rose from nearby tables. Waiters in black jackets carried trays of champagne through the crowd while investors discussed future contracts worth millions of dollars. Yet for Naomi, the sound of the gala had faded into something distant, like noise heard through a closed door. She watched Alexander carefully, noticing the subtle shift in his posture as he straightened his shoulders slightly, the same small movement he always made when concluding a difficult negotiation. It was the gesture of a man finalizing an outcome. When he spoke again, his voice remained calm, almost gentle, but the distance in it was unmistakable. "You should think carefully about what you are choosing," he said. Naomi did not move. "I already have." Alexander studied her face as if searching for hesitation that was no longer there. For years he had been able to read people quickly. It was one of the skills that made him successful in rooms like this one. But Naomi's expression tonight carried a quiet certainty he had not expected. The softness he remembered was still present, but beneath it was something steadier, something that did not bend easily. He glanced briefly toward the ballroom entrance where a group of executives were approaching him with polite smiles, clearly waiting for another opportunity to congratulate the man of the hour. Alexander looked back at Naomi and lowered his voice even further. "Then we are finished here." The sentence landed with quiet precision, the way a judge might close a case with a single sentence. Naomi felt the words settle in her chest, but instead of pain, she felt a strange clarity. Perhaps it was because she had already sensed this outcome the moment his expression had hardened earlier in the evening. The version of Alexander who might have celebrated this news had existed years ago, before success had turned every aspect of his life into strategy and control. She nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth he had just spoken. "Yes," she said softly. For a moment neither of them spoke again. The music swelled slightly as the quartet began another piece, the violin notes drifting across the ballroom like a quiet snowfall. Naomi realized that this might be the last time she would ever stand beside Alexander Grant in a room like this. The last time she would be introduced as the woman who shared his life. The realization did not break her the way she once imagined it might. Instead, it felt like the closing of a door that had already been slowly swinging shut. Alexander adjusted the cuff of his jacket with the same composed precision he used before stepping on stage. "You should arrange to collect your things from the apartment," he said, his tone returning fully to the calm professionalism that had made him famous in boardrooms across the country. Naomi noticed the shift immediately. The conversation had moved from personal emotion to practical logistics. It was the language he understood best. She took a slow breath. "I will." Alexander nodded once, as though confirming a simple business arrangement. "My assistant can coordinate a time." The sentence carried no hostility, no bitterness, just efficiency. Naomi felt a faint ache at how easily he had separated their life together into items to be collected and schedules to be arranged. For 3 years the penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park had been their home. They had watched the city lights from its floor-to-ceiling windows on quiet nights. They had eaten late dinners at the kitchen counter when both of them returned from long days of work. Yet now it had become another asset to manage, another detail to close. Naomi lifted her chin slightly. "That will not be necessary," she said. Alexander looked at her with mild curiosity. "You do not want assistance?" Naomi shook her head gently. "I will take care of it myself." He did not question her further. Efficiency was something he respected, even when it came from someone leaving his life. Across the ballroom a group of investors called his name, raising their glasses toward him. The attention reminded Naomi that this evening had never truly been about their conversation. To everyone else in the room, Alexander Grant was still the brilliant executive who had just delivered a speech about the future of American industry. Naomi glanced briefly toward the stage, watching the lights reflect off the polished floor. For a moment, she imagined what the crowd would think if they knew that the celebrated CEO had just ended his relationship with the woman standing beside him because she refused to abandon the life growing inside her. But she already knew the answer. Most of them would never understand the choice she had made, and she did not need them to. When she looked back at Alexander, her expression was calm. "You should return to your guests," she said quietly. Alexander followed her gaze toward the tables of investors and board members waiting for him. He paused for a brief moment, as if considering whether there was anything else left to say. Finally he spoke again, his voice steady but quieter than before. "Naomi, this outcome does not need to be difficult if you approach it rationally." The words sounded like advice he might give to a colleague facing a difficult decision. Naomi felt the faintest hint of sadness at how completely he had retreated behind that voice. "Some decisions are not about being rational," she replied. Alexander did not respond. Instead, he simply looked at her one last time, the bright chandelier light reflecting in his pale blue eyes. For a fraction of a second, she wondered whether he felt even the smallest trace of doubt about the path he had chosen. But if he did not allow it to surface. Alexander Grant had built his entire life on certainty. Without another word, he turned slightly toward the group of investors waiting across the ballroom. Naomi watched him take 2 steps away before stopping again. He looked back once more, not with regret, but with a quiet finality. Then he walked into the crowd that had come to celebrate him. Within seconds, several executives surrounded him again, shaking his hand, congratulating him on the success of his company. Laughter rose once more from the tables. Cameras flashed. To the rest of the room, nothing had changed. Naomi remained standing near the center of the ballroom for another moment, her hand resting gently against her stomach. Beneath the soft music and bright lights, she felt a calm settle inside her chest, a calm that surprised even her. The future ahead would not be easy. She knew that much. The apartment would be gone. The life she had built beside Alexander would disappear. And the child she carried would grow up without the father who had just walked away. Yet the quiet certainty inside her did not fade. Naomi Carter slowly turned toward the exit of the ballroom. The marble floor gleamed beneath the chandelier light as she walked across it with steady steps. Guests continued laughing and celebrating around her, unaware that a chapter of her life had just ended in the center of their elegant evening. When she reached the tall glass doors at the entrance, she pushed them open and stepped outside into the sharp winter air. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees, and the cold breeze rushed against her face as the sounds of the gala faded behind her. Naomi pulled her coat closer around her shoulders and looked out across the city lights of Manhattan stretching endlessly into the night. For the first time since leaving the ballroom, she allowed herself a slow breath. Then she placed her hand over her stomach again and whispered quietly into the cold air, "It is just you and me now." And as the wind moved softly through the streets below, Naomi Carter stepped forward into a future that no longer belonged to Alexander Grant. The cold Manhattan air followed Naomi Carter for several blocks as she walked away from the ballroom that had quietly closed the chapter of her old life. The city was still alive despite the late hour. Yellow taxis moved steadily through the avenues. Steam rose from street grates into the winter night. Neon lights reflected across wet pavement where the temperature had begun to drop below freezing. Naomi walked slowly, not because she was unsure of where to go, but because every step carried the weight of a future that had suddenly become entirely her responsibility. The gala behind her had been warm with champagne, music, and celebration. Out here the air measured barely 28 degrees, sharp enough to make every breath visible. Naomi pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and paused briefly beneath a street lamp, its pale light falling across the sidewalk. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach again, resting there with a quiet protectiveness that had already begun to feel natural. The tiny life inside her could not yet be felt, could not yet be heard, but Naomi knew it was there with a certainty that made the cold night feel less empty. A black car passed slowly along the avenue, and for a moment, she wondered whether Alexander might step outside the ballroom and come looking for her. The thought flickered across her mind and disappeared just as quickly. Alexander Grant was not a man who chased after decisions he had already made. Naomi understood that now with painful clarity. By the time she reached the subway entrance 3 blocks away, the sounds of the gala had completely vanished behind her. The city's underground station carried its own rhythm of late-night commuters, the rumble of trains echoing through concrete tunnels as people hurried through the turnstiles with scarves wrapped around their faces. Naomi descended the steps carefully, her heels clicking softly against the metal stairs before reaching the platform below. She had taken this train many times before, though usually at earlier hours when the city still buzzed with evening traffic. Tonight the station felt quieter, almost reflective, as if the city itself had slowed down long enough to notice the woman standing alone beneath the fluorescent lights. Naomi leaned gently against one of the tiled pillars as she waited for the train, her breath steadying while her mind replayed the conversation that had just changed everything. Alexander's voice still echoed clearly in her memory. Calm, controlled, certain, the same voice that had convinced investors to trust him with their fortunes. Yet tonight it had also drawn a line through the life they had shared. Naomi did not cry. The tears she had expected never arrived. Instead, she felt something stronger replacing them. Determination. She had grown up watching her mother raise 2 children with patience and quiet resilience after Naomi's father passed away when she was 12 years old. Her mother had never spoken about sacrifice as though it were a burden. She had treated it as a simple responsibility that came with love. Naomi understood that responsibility now in a way she had never expected. The train arrived with a rush of wind and a low metallic roar, its doors sliding open as passengers stepped inside the nearly empty car. Naomi took a seat near the window and watched the platform disappear as the train pulled away from the station. The lights of Manhattan blurred into streaks of gold and white against the dark glass. She knew the penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park was only 15 minutes away by subway, yet the thought of returning there felt strange now. For 3 years it had been home. Tonight it would simply be a place where she gathered the pieces of her life before leaving it behind. When the train finally reached her stop, Naomi stepped back into the cold night air and began walking toward the familiar tower where she had lived with Alexander. The building rose more than 40 stories above the street, its glass exterior reflecting the glow of surrounding skyscrapers. The doorman standing near the entrance recognized her immediately and opened the door with the same respectful nod he had given her countless times before. "Good evening, Miss Carter," he said politely. Naomi offered a small smile. "Good evening." The lobby was warm and quiet, decorated with polished marble floors and soft golden lighting. Naomi crossed the space slowly, aware that this might be the last time she entered the building as someone who belonged there. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 39th floor. As the doors closed, she watched her reflection in the mirrored wall. The woman looking back at her appeared calm, composed, almost serene despite everything that had just happened. Naomi realized that the calm came from knowing her path forward was clear. When the elevator opened onto the penthouse floor, the hallway was silent. She walked toward the door of the apartment and paused briefly before unlocking it. The interior greeted her with the familiar scent of cedar wood and the quiet hum of city lights glowing beyond the massive windows. The apartment was exactly as she had left it earlier that evening. The kitchen counter still held the glass of water she had been drinking before leaving for the gala. A coat rested neatly across the back of one of the dining chairs. The large living room windows revealed the endless grid of Manhattan stretching into the distance, thousands of lights blinking like distant stars. Naomi stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her. The silence in the apartment felt deeper than the noise of the city outside. For several minutes, she simply stood there, absorbing the space where so many memories lived. She remembered late nights when Alexander returned from business trips and they shared quiet dinners while watching the skyline. She remembered mornings when sunlight poured through the glass walls as they drank coffee together before rushing off to their separate meetings. All of it felt strangely distant now, like scenes from a life that had belonged to someone else. Naomi finally moved toward the bedroom and opened the closet. Rows of neatly arranged clothing lined the shelves, evidence of the organized life she and Alexander had built together. She pulled a suitcase from the top shelf and placed it on the bed. Slowly, methodically, she began folding the clothes she knew she would take with her. Each movement felt calm and deliberate. She was not rushing. She was simply closing one chapter before beginning another. As she worked, her hand rested occasionally against her stomach, the quiet reminder of the life that had already begun changing everything. Outside the tall windows, Manhattan continued glowing with endless motion and possibility. Naomi Carter glanced once more at the skyline before returning to the suitcase on the bed. The future ahead would not be defined by the luxury of this apartment or the influence of the man who had walked away from her tonight. It would be defined by the small heartbeat growing within her, a future she had chosen with clear and unwavering certainty. The soft sound of fabric folding continued long after midnight, as Naomi Carter finished packing the suitcase resting on the bed inside the quiet penthouse. The city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows had not slowed down. Streams of headlights still moved along the avenues like glowing rivers, and distant sirens occasionally echoed through the night air. But inside the apartment, the world felt strangely still. Naomi closed the suitcase gently and sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands resting for a moment on the smooth leather surface, as if acknowledging that the life contained in that suitcase represented the final pieces of something she was leaving behind. The apartment remained silent except for the quiet hum of the building's heating system. Alexander had not returned. She realized he might not return until very late, perhaps choosing to remain at the gala long enough for the celebration to fade into after-midnight conversations with investors and board members. It would be easier that way, easier for both of them. Naomi stood slowly and carried the suitcase toward the living room where the massive windows revealed Manhattan glowing beneath the winter sky. For 3 years that view had symbolized everything Alexander Grant had built. Power, influence, success measured in glass towers and global markets. Naomi had admired it once. Tonight it simply looked like a city moving forward without waiting for anyone. She placed the suitcase beside the door and returned to the kitchen. The glass of water she had left earlier still sat on the counter. Naomi lifted it and took a slow sip before placing it back down. Her hand moved once more to her stomach, the gesture quiet but steady. 6 weeks. The doctor had explained that the tiny heartbeat she had seen on the ultrasound screen was only beginning its journey. Months remained before she would hear the sound again. Months before the child would take a first breath in the world. Yet the responsibility already felt real. Naomi glanced around the apartment one final time before walking toward the door. When she stepped into the hallway, the quiet of the building felt deeper than before. The elevator carried her down 39 floors in silence, its mirrored walls reflecting the calm expression on her face. When the doors opened onto the lobby, the doorman looked up with mild surprise at the suitcase beside her. He stepped forward immediately. "Miss Carter, can I call a car for you?" Naomi offered a small, appreciative smile. "Thank you, but that will not be necessary. A taxi will be fine." The doorman nodded respectfully and opened the door for her. The cold night air wrapped around her again as she stepped onto the sidewalk. Snow had begun to fall lightly across the city, small flakes drifting through the glow of streetlights before melting against the pavement. Naomi pulled her coat tighter and raised her hand to signal a passing taxi. Within seconds, a yellow cab slowed to the curb and the driver leaned slightly across the seat to open the back door. Naomi placed the suitcase inside and slid into the seat, giving the driver the address of a small apartment she had rented several weeks earlier in Brooklyn. She had arranged the place quietly after discovering she was pregnant, unsure of when she might need a space that belonged only to her. The driver nodded and pulled away from the curb, merging into the steady traffic flowing through Manhattan. As the car moved across the bridge, the skyline rose behind them in a glittering wall of light. Naomi watched it through the window, the towering buildings slowly shrinking in the distance. Somewhere among those lights stood the penthouse she had just left behind. Somewhere inside it, Alexander Grant would eventually return, perhaps late in the night when the celebration ended and the crowd dispersed. Naomi wondered briefly whether he would notice the empty closet space or the absence of her suitcase near the door. The thought passed quickly. Alexander had already accepted the outcome. The taxi reached Brooklyn nearly 20 minutes later and turned onto a quieter residential street, lined with older brick buildings and narrow sidewalks dusted with snow. The driver stopped beside a modest apartment building with a single yellow light glowing above the entrance. Naomi paid the fare, thanked the driver, and stepped out into the cold night. The neighborhood was quieter than Manhattan, the distant hum of the city softened by the rows of residential buildings and small corner shops now closed for the evening. Naomi carried the suitcase up the short set of steps and unlocked the front door. The apartment inside was simple but warm. Hardwood floors creaked softly beneath her feet as she stepped inside and placed the suitcase beside the couch. A small lamp in the corner illuminated the living room with gentle light, revealing a tidy space she had prepared carefully over the past few weeks. A small dining table stood near the window. A bookshelf held a few novels and business journals she had brought earlier. And near the far wall rested a wooden rocking chair she had purchased quietly 2 days before, unsure exactly why, but feeling drawn to it all the same. Naomi closed the door and leaned briefly against it, allowing the silence of the new apartment to settle around her. The sound of traffic here was softer. The city felt farther away. She walked slowly across the living room and rested her hand against the back of the rocking chair. The smooth wood cool beneath her fingers. For a moment she imagined the future she had chosen. Nights spent soothing a restless infant. Early mornings filled with quiet routines and new responsibilities. A child growing year by year inside this modest apartment, learning to walk across these wooden floors, learning to laugh in the sunlight that would eventually pour through the windows. Naomi felt a faint smile touch her lips. It would not be the life she once imagined, but it would be real. She moved toward the small bedroom and opened the closet, placing the suitcase carefully on the floor. The apartment might have been smaller than the penthouse she left behind, but it held something the other place never truly offered: peace. Naomi returned to the living room and lowered herself slowly into the rocking chair, the wood shifting gently beneath her weight as it began to move back and forth in a quiet rhythm. Outside the window, the snow continued falling softly. Across the quiet Brooklyn street, Naomi placed both hands gently over her stomach and closed her eyes for a moment. The future ahead remained uncertain, but the choice she had made no longer felt heavy. It felt purposeful. And somewhere beyond the silent winter night, the city continued turning, unaware that inside a small apartment in Brooklyn a woman had just begun building a life entirely her own. Morning arrived quietly over Brooklyn as pale sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Naomi Carter's small apartment. The snow that had fallen during the night rested lightly along the sidewalks and rooftops outside, turning the street into a calm winter scene that felt worlds away from the bright towers of Manhattan. Naomi woke slowly in the unfamiliar bedroom, the soft ticking of a small clock on the nightstand reminding her that the previous evening had not been a dream. For a moment she remained still beneath the blankets, listening to the faint sounds of the neighborhood waking up. Somewhere downstairs a door closed. A car engine started along the street. Life was moving forward again. Naomi sat up carefully and rested her hands against her stomach, a quiet habit that had already become instinct. 6 weeks was still early, the doctor had told her, yet the responsibility already felt as real as the winter air outside. She rose from the bed and walked toward the kitchen where the apartment's single window faced the narrow street below. A thin layer of snow coated the parked cars and the branches of a small tree near the corner. Naomi turned on the kettle and waited while the water warmed, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. The woman staring back looked different from the one who had stood in the penthouse overlooking Central Park only 24 hours earlier. Not weaker, not broken, just changed. The kettle began to whistle softly, and Naomi poured hot water into a mug, adding a tea bag before carrying it to the small dining table near the window. She sat down slowly and allowed herself a quiet moment to think about the future ahead. The apartment might have been modest, but it held something the penthouse never had. Every object inside it belonged to her decisions alone. The thought filled her with a quiet sense of control she had not expected. Later that morning, Naomi dressed in a warm sweater and winter coat before stepping outside into the cold Brooklyn air. The snow beneath her boots crunched lightly as she walked down the sidewalk toward the subway station at the corner. Commuters moved steadily along the street, their breath visible in the freezing air as they hurried toward work. Naomi joined the flow of people descending into the underground station, the rumble of approaching trains echoing through the tiled tunnels. For years, she had traveled across the city to work in the marketing division of a logistics consulting firm based in Midtown Manhattan. The job had been demanding but rewarding, giving her the chance to build her own professional identity separate from Alexander Grant's towering reputation. She had continued working even after moving into the penthouse, determined to maintain a life that belonged to her as much as it belonged to him. Now that independence would matter more than ever. The train arrived and Naomi stepped into the crowded car, gripping the metal pole as it lurched forward into the tunnel. As the train moved beneath the East River, she stared quietly at the map above the door, following the familiar route toward Manhattan. She knew that returning to work would raise questions. Some of her colleagues had attended the gala the previous evening and might have noticed her leaving early. Others might already be speculating about the sudden changes in her life. Naomi inhaled slowly and reminded herself that speculation did not define her future. By the time the train reached Midtown, the morning rush had fully taken over the city. Naomi stepped onto the busy platform and followed the crowd up the stairs into the cold sunlight. Skyscrapers rose above the streets like steel mountains reflecting the pale winter sky. Taxis honked impatiently, while pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks carrying briefcases and coffee cups. Naomi walked the 4 blocks to her office building with steady steps, the familiar rhythm of the city beginning to settle her thoughts. When she entered the lobby, the security guard at the front desk nodded politely. "Good morning, Miss Carter." Naomi returned the greeting with a small smile before heading toward the elevators. The marketing firm occupied the 20th floor of the building, a modern office filled with glass partitions and long rows of desks where employees worked on logistic strategies for companies moving products across the country. When Naomi stepped inside, several colleagues looked up and waved casually. Her closest co-worker, a cheerful analyst named Laura Bennett, immediately approached with a bright smile. "Naomi, you made it in this morning," Laura said. "I heard the gala last night was incredible." Naomi placed her coat over the back of her chair and nodded gently. "It was certainly memorable." Laura laughed softly. "I wish I could have seen it. Alexander Grant hosting a room full of investors must have been quite a show." Naomi felt the familiar name pass through the air like a distant echo. She kept her expression calm. It was a busy evening. Laura seemed satisfied with the answer and returned to her desk, leaving Naomi alone with her thoughts. Naomi sat down at her computer and began reviewing the day's project reports, the routine tasks helping her mind focus again. Hours passed as she analyzed marketing data and coordinated campaign plans for several clients. The normalcy of the work reminded her that despite the dramatic changes in her personal life, the professional world continued moving forward with predictable structure. Around noon, Naomi stepped into the break room and poured a glass of water before leaning briefly against the counter. A television mounted on the wall displayed a financial news program discussing recent developments in the logistics industry. Naomi glanced up just as a familiar image appeared on the screen. Alexander Grant stood at a podium during the previous evening's gala, his confident voice playing through the speakers as reporters discussed his company's expansion plans. The segment praised his leadership and predicted continued growth for Grant Industries in the coming year. Naomi watched for a moment before turning away from the screen. The man on television looked exactly as the world expected him to look. Focused, successful, unshaken. She returned to her desk without saying a word. That evening after work, Naomi took the subway back to Brooklyn as the winter sky faded into darkness above the city. When she stepped into her apartment, the quiet space greeted her with a warmth that felt increasingly familiar. She placed her bag on the table and walked toward the rocking chair near the window, lowering herself into its gentle rhythm. Outside, the snow had begun falling again, soft flakes drifting beneath the streetlights. Naomi rested both hands against her stomach and closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the calm movement of the chair beneath her. The world beyond the apartment walls continued racing forward with headlines, markets, and powerful decisions made in glass towers across Manhattan. But inside this small Brooklyn apartment, another future was slowly beginning. One built not on ambition or reputation, but on quiet determination and the promise of a life that Naomi Carter had already chosen to protect. Winter slowly loosened its grip on New York as the weeks passed, and with each new morning, Naomi Carter felt the quiet rhythm of her new life settling into place. The small apartment in Brooklyn began to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like a foundation she was carefully building day by day. The rocking chair near the window became her favorite place in the evenings, especially as the weather softened and the snow outside gradually melted into the steady rain of early spring. Naomi's routine had become simple but purposeful. Each morning she woke before the sun fully rose, prepared a cup of tea, and sat for a few minutes beside the window while the neighborhood stirred to life. The city beyond Brooklyn remained busy and loud, but inside the apartment, the quiet moments felt like preparation for the life that was steadily growing within her. The doctor had confirmed during her second visit that everything was progressing normally. Naomi remembered the moment clearly. She had been lying on the examination table in a small clinic only a few subway stops away when the technician placed the ultrasound wand gently against her stomach. The room had been dimly lit, the monitor glowing softly as the image flickered into view. Naomi had held her breath without realizing it. Then the technician smiled and adjusted the screen slightly. A tiny rhythmic pulse appeared in the center of the image. "There it is," the technician had said gently. "That is the heartbeat." Naomi had stared at the screen in quiet amazement, her eyes filling with tears she had not expected. The sound followed a second later through the small speaker in the room, a rapid rhythmic beat that filled the air with something more powerful than any words. It was the first time Naomi had truly heard the life she had chosen to protect. When she left the clinic that afternoon, she carried the printed sonogram picture carefully in her purse like a fragile promise. Now, weeks later, that photograph rested on the small table beside her bed in the apartment, a reminder that the future she was building was already real. Naomi continued working at the marketing firm, though her days felt slightly different now. The morning train rides into Manhattan remained crowded and fast-paced. Yet Naomi no longer felt the same pressure she once had to keep up with every ambition surrounding her. She worked carefully and efficiently, completing projects with the same professionalism she had always maintained, but she also allowed herself small pauses during the day to breathe and think about the child who would soon change her life completely. One afternoon, as Naomi reviewed campaign data at her desk, Laura Bennett leaned across the divider with a curious smile. "You seem quieter lately," Laura said lightly. Naomi looked up from her computer and returned the smile. "Just focusing on work." Laura studied her for a moment before nodding. "Well, if anyone can handle pressure, it is you." Naomi thanked her softly and returned to her screen, grateful that Laura did not press further. The truth was that Naomi had not told anyone at the office about her pregnancy yet. The news still felt too personal, too closely tied to a chapter of her life she was carefully closing. But she knew the time would come soon when the secret could no longer remain hidden. Months passed gradually as spring arrived in full color across the city. Trees along the Brooklyn streets began to bloom, and the sunlight filtering through Naomi's apartment windows grew warmer each day. By the beginning of summer, Naomi's body had begun to change in ways that made the pregnancy impossible to hide. One evening she stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, resting her hands gently against the curve of her stomach. The movement inside her had grown stronger, small fluttering motions that felt like tiny waves beneath the surface. Naomi smiled softly, feeling the quiet reassurance of the life growing stronger each day. That same week, she finally shared the news with Laura during a quiet lunch break in the office cafe. Laura's eyes widened in surprise before quickly filling with warmth. "Naomi, that is incredible," she said. "You are going to be an amazing mother." Naomi felt a wave of gratitude at the sincerity in her friend's voice. "Thank you," she replied quietly. Laura hesitated. Before asking the question Naomi knew would eventually come. "Is the father involved?" Naomi paused for a moment before answering with calm honesty. "No, it will just be the two of us." Laura nodded slowly, understanding more from Naomi's expression than from her words. She reached across the table and squeezed Naomi's hand gently. "Then that child is already lucky to have you." Naomi carried that sentence with her long after the conversation ended. By the time autumn returned to the city, the baby was ready to enter the world. Naomi had prepared carefully in the months leading up to the due date, turning the small bedroom in the apartment into a nursery filled with soft blankets, a crib, and the rocking chair she had purchased on that quiet winter night. The hospital visit arrived during the early hours of a cool October morning, when Naomi felt the first steady signs that the baby was coming. A neighbor from her building kindly drove her to the hospital nearby, where doctors and nurses guided her calmly through the long hours that followed. When the moment finally arrived and the child's first cry filled the hospital room, Naomi felt every worry and uncertainty dissolve into something far more powerful. The nurse placed the tiny newborn gently into her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket. Naomi looked down into the baby's face and felt a quiet awe she had never known before. The child's small eyes opened briefly, revealing a familiar shade of blue that reminded her instantly of the man who would never know this moment. Naomi brushed her finger gently across the baby's tiny hand and whispered softly, "Welcome to the world." She had already chosen the name months earlier during a quiet evening in the rocking chair beside the window. Elijah, a name that meant strength and promise. As Naomi held her son close in the hospital room, she understood that the life she had built over the past year had led to this exact moment. The future ahead would not be easy, but it would be hers. And as Elijah Carter rested peacefully against her chest, Naomi knew with absolute certainty that the decision she made beneath the bright lights of that Manhattan ballroom had been the beginning of something far greater than the life she left behind. The first winter of Elijah Carter's life arrived quietly over Brooklyn, bringing cold winds through the narrow streets and a thin layer of snow along the sidewalks outside Naomi Carter's apartment. Inside the small home, the warmth of a new routine had already settled into place. The rocking chair near the window moved slowly back and forth as Naomi held Elijah close against her chest, the soft blanket wrapped around his tiny shoulders while the city lights glowed through the glass behind them. Elijah was only a few months old, yet his presence had already transformed every corner of the apartment. Bottles warmed quietly on the kitchen counter. Small clothes hung neatly beside the crib in the bedroom. The sound of gentle breathing filled the quiet nights in a way Naomi had never experienced before. Life had become structured around simple moments. Feeding him in the early hours before sunrise. Walking him slowly through the neighborhood in the afternoon when the winter sun briefly warmed the sidewalks. Sitting beside the window in the evening while Elijah rested against her shoulder, his tiny fingers curling instinctively around her hand. The days were sometimes exhausting, but Naomi never felt alone in the way she once feared she might. Each small smile Elijah offered felt like reassurance that she had chosen the right path. By the time spring returned, Elijah had grown stronger, his bright blue eyes following Naomi across the room with curious attention whenever she moved. Those eyes always caught Naomi's attention. They carried a color she recognized instantly, the same shade she had once seen every morning across the kitchen table of the penthouse apartment she had left behind. Yet instead of pain, the resemblance brought a quiet reminder of how far she had come. Elijah did not belong to Alexander Grant's world of boardrooms and corporate headlines. He belonged to the life Naomi was building one steady day at a time. Naomi returned to work several months after Elijah's birth, balancing motherhood and her career with the careful planning she had learned over years of professional discipline. A kind woman in the building, named Mrs. Alvarez, watched Elijah during the workday, treating the child with the gentle patience of someone who had raised 3 children of her own. Each morning Naomi carried Elijah downstairs before heading to the subway, kissing his forehead before stepping into the busy rhythm of the city once again. Work remained demanding, but Naomi's focus had sharpened in unexpected ways. The responsibilities of motherhood had strengthened her determination to succeed professionally as well. Her supervisors noticed the precision and creativity she brought to every campaign strategy she developed. Within a year, she had been promoted to a senior marketing role, leading several major projects for companies expanding their shipping networks across the country. Evenings were always reserved for Elijah. Naomi would return to the apartment just before sunset, the smell of dinner drifting through the small kitchen, while Elijah laughed from the living room floor surrounded by brightly colored toys. She would lift him into her arms and feel the small weight of him settle comfortably against her shoulder. Those quiet moments made every long workday worthwhile. Years passed with surprising speed. Elijah grew from a quiet infant into an energetic child who filled the apartment with laughter and endless questions about the world around him. By the time he turned 6, he had already developed a habit of sitting beside the window in the same rocking chair Naomi once used during her pregnancy, watching the snow fall outside with thoughtful curiosity. His hair had grown into soft dark curls, and his blue eyes carried a spark of intelligence that teachers quickly noticed during his first year of school. One evening Naomi helped Elijah with his reading assignment at the small dining table while the sound of distant traffic hummed through the Brooklyn streets outside. Elijah paused in the middle of a sentence and looked up at her thoughtfully. "Mom," he said quietly, "why do some kids have dads at school events, but I only see you?" Naomi had always known the question would come eventually. She placed the book gently on the table and looked at her son with calm honesty. "Some families look different from others," she explained softly. "In our family, it has always been the 2 of us." Elijah considered the answer for a moment before nodding slowly. "I like our family," he said. Naomi smiled and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. "So do I." Across the river in Manhattan, another life had continued moving forward along a very different path. Alexander Grant remained one of the most recognizable executives in the logistics industry. His company had expanded rapidly over the past several years, acquiring smaller firms and developing international shipping routes that placed Grant Industries among the most influential corporations in North America. Business magazines regularly featured his achievements. Financial news channels praised his strategic vision. Yet despite the public success surrounding him, Alexander's private life had remained notably quiet. He rarely appeared at social events unrelated to business. Interviews often revealed little beyond his professional goals and market forecasts. The world saw him as a man completely dedicated to his empire. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, Naomi Carter continued building something entirely different. A life defined not by headlines or market share, but by steady determination and love. On a bright spring afternoon, nearly 7 years after Elijah's birth, Naomi walked hand in hand with her son through a small park near their apartment. Trees had begun blooming again, filling the air with the gentle scent of fresh leaves while children played across the grassy field. Elijah ran ahead briefly, chasing a bright red kite that fluttered in the wind above the playground. Naomi watched him with a quiet smile, the sunlight reflecting across his bright eyes as he laughed. In that moment, she realized how much of the past had quietly faded into the distance. The choices she made years earlier had led to this simple afternoon, a moment filled not with regret, but with pride. Naomi Carter had once walked away from a life of extraordinary luxury to protect the child she carried beneath her heart. Now that child was running freely across a park beneath the warm spring sun, completely unaware of the powerful world he had never needed. And as Naomi stood beneath the blooming trees watching her son's joyful laughter drift through the air, she understood that the future she had built was stronger than anything she had ever left behind. Spring deepened across New York as the city moved toward another busy season of conferences, business summits, and corporate announcements. In Manhattan, the glass towers of the financial district reflected bright morning sunlight across the Hudson River, while executives hurried between meetings carrying briefcases and laptops. Among those towers, the headquarters of Grant Industries stood taller than ever, its polished exterior symbolizing nearly a decade of relentless expansion under the leadership of Alexander Grant. Inside the executive floor of the building, Alexander stood near the large window of his office, reviewing the city skyline the same way he had done nearly every morning for years. The view stretched across Manhattan in every direction, the streets below alive with taxis, buses, and the steady rhythm of a city that never slowed down. On the desk, behind him, several reports waited for his signature, each one detailing another contract, another merger, another strategic partnership that would extend the reach of his company even further across global markets. To the outside world, Alexander Grant represented precision and control, a leader whose decisions moved industries and shaped supply networks across continents. Yet the office itself remained quiet in a way that hinted at the cost of that success. No photographs decorated the desk. No personal objects interrupted the clean lines of glass and steel. The room belonged entirely to business. His assistant knocked softly before stepping inside with a tablet in her hand. "Mr. Grant," she said respectfully, "the Global Logistics Summit confirmed your keynote address for next month. The event will take place at the Hudson Convention Center." Alexander nodded without turning from the window. "Send the preparation materials to my calendar." The assistant hesitated briefly before adding, "The conference will include several regional logistics firms that have recently gained attention in the market. One company in particular has been mentioned frequently in the industry reports." Alexander turned slightly toward the desk. "Which company?" She glanced at the screen. "Carter Logistics Solutions. They have developed a new regional distribution model that several major retailers are beginning to adopt." The name meant nothing to Alexander in that moment. Hundreds of companies appeared in industry briefings every year, most of them small firms hoping to gain recognition by presenting innovative strategies. Alexander simply nodded again. "Include them in the briefing documents." The assistant acknowledged the instruction and quietly left the office. Alexander returned his attention to the skyline outside, unaware that the name she had just spoken carried a connection to a past he had carefully placed behind him. Across the river in Brooklyn, the morning began much differently. Naomi Carter stood in the kitchen of her apartment pouring a glass of orange juice, while Elijah finished tying the laces of his sneakers near the front door. At 7 years old, Elijah had grown into a lively child with endless curiosity about the world around him. His bright blue eyes reflected the morning sunlight streaming through the window as he grabbed his small backpack from the chair. "Mom," he called cheerfully, "do not forget it is science project day." Naomi laughed softly as she handed him the lunch she had packed. "I would not forget. Your volcano model is already in the car." Elijah grinned proudly and slipped his backpack over his shoulders before stepping out onto the sidewalk with Naomi beside him. The Brooklyn streets were already busy with parents walking children toward school and commuters heading toward the subway station. Naomi had changed jobs 3 years earlier after helping develop a logistics campaign that impressed several regional retailers. The opportunity allowed her to co-found Carter Logistics Solutions, a company focused on efficient distribution systems for mid-sized businesses that often struggled to compete with larger corporate supply chains. The company began modestly with only a small office and 3 employees, but Naomi's strategic insight quickly attracted clients who appreciated her practical approach to logistics management. Over time, Carter Logistics Solutions expanded into a respected regional firm known for innovative solutions and reliable partnerships. Naomi balanced the responsibilities of running the company with motherhood, often bringing Elijah to the office after school, where he completed homework at a desk near her office window. That morning, Naomi drove Elijah to school before continuing toward the Carter Logistics office located in a renovated warehouse building not far from the Brooklyn waterfront. The office environment was warm and collaborative, filled with employees discussing shipment routes and transportation analytics across large digital displays mounted on the walls. Naomi greeted several team members as she walked toward the conference room where a strategy meeting was about to begin. The company had recently received an invitation to present their distribution model at the upcoming Global Logistics Summit in Manhattan, an event attended by some of the most influential figures in the shipping and supply chain industry. Naomi reviewed the presentation slides carefully as her team discussed key data points and projected growth forecasts. She understood the importance of this opportunity. The summit would place Carter Logistics Solutions directly in front of industry leaders capable of expanding their partnerships nationwide. Yet Naomi approached the preparation with calm focus rather than anxiety. She had spent years building the company step by step, learning from every challenge and success along the way. The summit would simply be another step forward. Late that afternoon, Naomi returned home to Brooklyn, where Elijah waited eagerly to show her the results of his science presentation. The small kitchen filled with laughter as Elijah described the moment his volcano model erupted during the demonstration in front of his class. Naomi listened with genuine delight, grateful that the life she had built allowed her to share these moments with him. As evening settled over the city, Naomi tucked Elijah into bed and kissed his forehead before turning off the bedroom light. The apartment fell quiet except for the distant hum of traffic along the streets below. Naomi walked into the living room and opened her laptop to review the final presentation outline for the upcoming summit. The event would bring together dozens of companies from across the country. She knew the audience would include major industry executives whose decisions influenced global supply chains. Naomi glanced at the summit schedule once more before closing the laptop. Among the listed keynote speakers, one name appeared near the top of the program: Alexander Grant. Naomi stared at the screen for a moment as the familiar name rested beneath the bright conference logo. Years had passed since the night she walked away from the life they once shared. In that time, Naomi had built a future defined by resilience, independence, and the laughter of the son sleeping peacefully in the next room. Seeing the name again did not bring fear or regret. Instead, it felt like the quiet turning of a page she had already finished writing. The upcoming summit would simply be another meeting of professionals within the same industry. Naomi closed the laptop and looked out the window where the lights of Manhattan shimmered across the dark water of the river. Somewhere beyond those towers, the man who had once walked away from her life continued building his empire. But inside the quiet apartment in Brooklyn, Naomi Carter rested her hand gently against the back of the rocking chair beside the window and felt nothing except the calm certainty that the future she had chosen had grown stronger than the past she had left behind. The morning of the Global Logistics Summit arrived with bright sunlight stretching across the Hudson River and reflecting against the tall glass walls of the Hudson Convention Center. The building stood beside the water like a modern monument to commerce and innovation, its wide entrance already crowded with executives, analysts, journalists, and representatives from logistics firms across the country. Black sedans pulled up to the curb while assistants checked digital schedules and security staff guided guests through the glass doors into the vast lobby inside. Naomi Carter stepped out of a taxi on the opposite side of the street, adjusting the strap of the leather briefcase resting on her shoulder before taking a slow breath. The air carried the crisp warmth of early summer and the distant sound of ferry horns moving across the river. Naomi paused for a moment as she looked up at the tall convention center, the polished glass reflecting the skyline of Manhattan behind it. For most attendees, this summit represented opportunity, networking, and strategic alliances. For Naomi, it represented something quieter, but just as important. It was proof that the company she had built from determination and long nights of work had earned a place among the industry leaders who once seemed impossibly distant. Inside the convention center, the main hall stretched across several levels, filled with booths displaying advanced tracking systems, distribution analytics platforms, and transportation technologies designed to reshape supply chains across North America. Large screens suspended above the floor displayed schedules and speaker announcements, while hundreds of participants moved between meeting rooms discussing contracts and partnerships. Naomi checked in at the registration desk, where a volunteer handed her a name badge printed with the words Carter Logistics Solutions beneath her name. She clipped the badge neatly onto her blazer before making her way toward the conference wing, where the first presentations would begin. Her team had arrived earlier to finalize the equipment in the presentation room assigned to Carter Logistics Solutions. When Naomi entered the room, two of her colleagues were adjusting the large display screen, while another reviewed the final slides on a tablet. Naomi greeted them with a calm smile and set her briefcase on the table near the front of the room. "Everything ready?" she asked. One of the team members nodded confidently. "The system tests are complete and the charts are loaded. We are scheduled to present in 30 minutes. Naomi reviewed the slides carefully once more, ensuring that the data visualizations clearly demonstrated the efficiency of their regional distribution model. The system had been developed through years of experimentation and field testing with clients who required faster, more reliable shipping networks across densely populated urban regions. Naomi knew the presentation would draw attention. The model offered a practical alternative to expensive national supply chains, something many mid-sized companies were searching for. Meanwhile, on the upper level of the convention center, the keynote session was preparing to begin. A large auditorium filled gradually with executives and journalists as cameras adjusted their focus toward the main stage. At precisely 9 o'clock, Alexander Grant stepped behind the podium, the quiet conversation among the crowd fading instantly as he began speaking. His voice carried the same calm authority that had defined his career for years, discussing global supply networks, international port partnerships, and the future of integrated logistics technology. The audience listened attentively as he outlined the strategies that had propelled Grant Industries to the forefront of global transportation systems. For many in the room, he represented the benchmark of success within the industry. Naomi's presentation room slowly filled with attendees curious about emerging regional solutions. When the scheduled time arrived, Naomi stepped forward and greeted the audience with steady confidence. Her voice was warm yet precise as she explained the origins of Carter Logistics Solutions and the challenges faced by mid-sized retailers navigating complex distribution networks. The large screen behind her displayed interactive charts illustrating how their model reduced transit times and operational costs while improving delivery reliability. As she moved through the presentation, Naomi noticed several attendees leaning forward with genuine interest, jotting notes and exchanging glances as the efficiency data appeared on the screen. The discussion session that followed brought thoughtful questions from logistics analysts and supply chain consultants who clearly recognized the value of the system she had developed. Nearly 40 minutes later, Naomi concluded the presentation with a simple statement. Innovation does not always require scale. Sometimes it requires understanding the needs of the people moving products every single day. Applause filled the room as attendees stood and approached the front to exchange business cards and discuss potential collaborations. Naomi answered questions patiently while her team gathered materials from the table. Once the room began to empty, she stepped into the hallway outside, where sunlight streamed through the tall windows overlooking the river. The corridor bustled with participants moving between sessions and networking events. Naomi checked the conference schedule on her tablet before walking toward the central lounge area where refreshments were being served. The lounge overlooked the wide glass atrium of the building, offering a clear view of the main floor below where exhibitors continued presenting their technologies. Naomi paused beside a small table and poured a cup of coffee, taking a moment to collect her thoughts after the successful presentation. Across the lounge, several executives were discussing transportation data, while journalists typed notes into laptops. The energy of the summit filled the air with anticipation and possibility. At that moment, the large doors at the far end of the lounge opened as the keynote session concluded upstairs. Groups of attendees began entering the corridor, continuing conversations about the trends and forecasts Alexander Grant had just described on stage. Naomi lifted her coffee cup and turned slightly toward the windows, unaware that among the crowd entering the lounge stood the man whose name had appeared on the summit's schedule the night before. Alexander stepped into the corridor, surrounded briefly by several industry reporters before excusing himself and walking toward the quieter side of the lounge. His attention remained focused on a message appearing on his phone as he moved past several tables near the window. Then, as he lifted his head to continue walking, his gaze paused unexpectedly. Across the room, near the glass wall, stood a woman he recognized instantly even after all the years that had passed. Naomi Carter. The recognition was immediate and unmistakable. She looked different in small ways. Her posture carried greater confidence, and her expression reflected the calm certainty of someone who had built her own path. Yet the quiet strength in her presence remained exactly as he remembered. For several seconds Alexander remained still where he stood, the noise of the summit continuing around him while his attention focused entirely on the woman across the room. Naomi sensed the shift in the air before she fully understood why. She turned slightly from the window and saw him standing there among the crowd of executives and reporters. Their eyes met across the lounge for the first time in nearly 8 years, and the distance between the past and the present suddenly felt far smaller than either of them expected. For a moment, the noise of the summit seemed to disappear around them. Naomi Carter stood near the glass wall of the lounge with the Hudson River shimmering behind her, while Alexander Grant remained several steps away among the crowd of executives who had just left the keynote auditorium. 8 years had passed since the night their lives separated beneath the chandeliers of a Manhattan ballroom, yet the recognition between them was immediate. Naomi noticed the subtle changes first. Alexander's posture remained straight and confident, his tailored suit as precise as ever, but the years had etched a quiet seriousness into his expression that had not been there before. The relentless climb of success had not softened him, but it had aged him in ways the business magazines never mentioned. Alexander, meanwhile, saw a different Naomi than the one who once stood beside him in the penthouse overlooking Central Park. She carried herself with calm assurance, the quiet composure of someone who had built something meaningful through effort rather than privilege. The badge clipped neatly to her blazer read Carter Logistics Solutions, a name that only hours earlier had meant nothing to him. Now the connection was impossible to ignore. Alexander stepped forward slowly through the lounge, excusing himself from a pair of reporters who had been following him with questions about his keynote speech. Naomi watched him approach without tension, her expression steady and thoughtful, as if she had already prepared herself for this moment long before it arrived. When Alexander finally stopped a few feet away from her, the sunlight from the tall windows reflected softly across the polished floor between them. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The hum of conversations continued around them while attendees moved between tables carrying coffee cups and conference brochures. Finally Alexander broke the silence with a quiet acknowledgement. Naomi. His voice carried the same measured tone she remembered, though something softer lingered beneath it now. Naomi nodded gently. Alexander. The simple exchange of names seemed to confirm what both of them already knew. Time had moved forward, but the memory of their shared past remained clear enough to recognize instantly. Alexander glanced briefly at the conference badge on her jacket before speaking again. Carter Logistics Solutions, he said thoughtfully. Your presentation earlier this morning was mentioned in several of the sessions upstairs. Naomi lifted her coffee cup slightly before placing it on the table beside her. We have been working on the distribution model for several years. Alexander studied her expression with quiet curiosity. You built the company. It was not exactly a question. Naomi nodded. Yes. The answer seemed to shift something behind his eyes. Alexander had spent years analyzing competitors and market trends, yet he had never imagined that Naomi Carter would become one of the emerging innovators within the same industry he dominated. It is impressive, he admitted calmly. Naomi accepted the compliment with a small nod, but did not allow the conversation to linger on praise. Instead, she looked toward the atrium below, where dozens of attendees continued moving between exhibition booths. The industry is changing quickly, she said. Companies are beginning to realize that scale is not always the most efficient solution. Alexander followed her gaze toward the main floor before replying. Scale remains necessary when networks become global. Naomi smiled slightly. True. But not every company needs to move across continents to succeed. The exchange sounded almost like a professional debate between two executives meeting for the first time rather than two people who once shared a life together. Alexander noticed the difference immediately. Naomi was no longer the woman who once waited beside him during business galas while investors praised his achievements. She was his equal now in the language of strategy and logistics. The realization carried an unexpected weight. Alexander rested his hands lightly against the back of a nearby chair as he considered his next words. You left the industry entirely when you moved away, he said. Naomi shook her head gently. I never left. I simply built something smaller first. Alexander nodded slowly as he absorbed the meaning behind that statement. The conversation paused again for a brief moment before Naomi glanced toward the digital conference schedule displayed on a screen near the entrance. Your keynote was well received, she said politely. Alexander followed her gaze toward the schedule where his name remained highlighted as the morning's featured speaker. It was a routine address. Naomi looked back at him with quiet sincerity. It still carries influence. Alexander seemed to consider that for a moment before asking a question he had not planned to ask when he first stepped into the lounge. Are you here alone? Naomi understood the question instantly. She did not hesitate. No. The answer lingered in the space between them with calm certainty. Alexander's brow tightened slightly, as if he expected the explanation to follow. Naomi lifted her briefcase from the chair and adjusted the strap over her shoulder before continuing. My son is downstairs in the atrium. The summit offers a youth technology exhibit for families. He insisted on seeing the robotics display. Alexander remained silent for several seconds. The word son echoed through his thoughts with an intensity he had not anticipated. Naomi spoke the sentence with the natural ease of someone describing an everyday part of her life, yet the implication behind it felt impossible to ignore. Alexander's voice lowered slightly when he finally spoke. You have a son. Naomi nodded. Yes. He looked toward the atrium below where groups of children gathered around the robotics demonstration near the far wall. How old? Naomi answered with the same calm tone she had used throughout their conversation. 7. The number seemed to slow Alexander's breathing almost imperceptibly. 7 years. The calculation required no effort. The timeline aligned with a memory he had spent nearly a decade refusing to revisit. Naomi watched the realization appear behind his composed expression. She had expected this moment eventually, though perhaps not in the middle of a crowded conference lounge surrounded by industry executives. Alexander's voice became quieter when he asked the next question. Does he know about me? Naomi looked at him steadily, the sunlight from the window outlining the calm determination in her face. No, the answer was simple but clear. Alexander glanced again toward the atrium where a small group of children laughed beside a robotic demonstration table. For the first time since stepping into the lounge, he seemed uncertain about what to say next. Naomi allowed the silence to settle naturally between them before speaking again. His name is Elijah. Alexander looked back at her slowly. The name carried a quiet weight that neither of them needed to explain. Somewhere below in the atrium, a child's laughter rose briefly above the crowd, bright and carefree against the hum of the conference. Naomi picked up her coffee cup and turned slightly toward the stairs leading down to the exhibition hall. He is waiting for me, she said gently. Then she looked back at Alexander one final time before stepping away from the table and walking toward the atrium, leaving him standing beside the window with the quiet realization that the life he once rejected had been growing all these years without him. Naomi Carter walked down the wide staircase toward the atrium of the Hudson Convention Center with steady steps, the quiet echo of her heels blending with the sound of voices rising from the exhibition floor below. Behind her, the lounge continued buzzing with industry executives discussing contracts, partnerships, and expansion strategies. Yet Naomi felt none of that noise inside her thoughts. She had known the moment would arrive someday when Alexander Grant would learn the truth about the life that had grown beyond his reach, but she had never imagined it would happen under the glass roof of a logistics summit surrounded by hundreds of professionals. As she reached the bottom of the staircase, the open atrium stretched before her, filled with bright displays of robotics demonstrations, automated sorting systems, and digital logistics simulations designed to capture the attention of visitors. In the center of the exhibition area, a group of children gathered around a robotics table where a small machine carefully stacked colored blocks under the guidance of a technician. Naomi immediately spotted Elijah standing near the edge of the demonstration area, his small backpack resting against the floor beside him, while his bright blue eyes followed the movements of the robotic arm with intense concentration. When he saw Naomi approaching, his face lit up with the same joyful smile that had filled her life for the past 7 years. "Mom," he called excitedly, waving his hand toward her. Naomi smiled warmly and walked toward him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead before glancing down at the robotics display he had been studying so carefully. "Did you see the machine sort the packages?" Elijah asked eagerly. Naomi nodded. "I saw the last demonstration. It looks like a very efficient system." Elijah grinned proudly as though he personally helped build the machine. "I think it could work even faster if the sensors were closer to the conveyor belt." Naomi laughed softly, recognizing the curiosity that had defined Elijah's personality since he first learned to walk. "You may be right," she replied. "Perhaps you should become an engineer someday." Elijah shrugged thoughtfully before turning his attention back to the robotic arm stacking blocks in perfect alignment. For a moment, Naomi simply stood beside him, allowing the calm happiness of the moment to settle around them. The life she had built over the past 8 years existed in scenes exactly like this one. Simple conversations, curious questions, the quiet pride of watching her son explore the world with bright eyes and endless imagination. Above the atrium, Alexander Grant remained standing near the glass wall of the lounge, looking down toward the exhibition floor where Naomi had just disappeared among the crowd of attendees and families. The revelation she had spoken moments earlier echoed through his thoughts with unexpected force. A son, 7 years old. The calculation had required no effort at all. The timeline aligned too perfectly to ignore. Alexander rested one hand against the railing overlooking the atrium while the summit continued around him, reporters asking questions and executives moving past with polite greetings. Yet for the first time in many years, the carefully controlled structure of his thoughts felt unsettled. He watched as Naomi moved through the crowd below and approached a young boy standing near the robotics display. Even from the distance, Alexander noticed the detail immediately. The child's bright blue eyes. The same unmistakable color he saw every morning in the mirror. The realization arrived quietly, but undeniably. Alexander remained standing there for several minutes, observing the simple interaction between mother and child. Naomi bent slightly to speak with Elijah while the boy excitedly pointed toward the robotic demonstration table. The scene carried none of the tension Alexander had expected. There was no accusation, no dramatic confrontation, only a calm life continuing without him. For years, Alexander Grant had believed the choice he made beneath the chandeliers of that ballroom was necessary for the future he intended to build. He had convinced himself that personal sacrifices were inevitable when constructing something as large as a global logistics empire. Yet as he watched Naomi guide Elijah gently through the exhibition displays, Alexander felt a quiet awareness forming in the back of his mind. The life he had rejected had not collapsed without him. It had grown stronger. Down in the atrium, Elijah finished examining the robotics display and looked up at Naomi with eager excitement. "Can we see the drone demonstration next?" he asked. Naomi nodded. "Of course. It starts in a few minutes near the west side of the hall." Elijah grabbed his backpack and began walking beside her through the exhibition area, while Naomi answered his questions about delivery drones and automated transportation systems. As they reached the drone demonstration stage, a technician launched a small aerial drone into the air, guiding it through a series of obstacles while explaining how such devices might transform package delivery in urban environments. Elijah watched the flight with wide eyes, completely absorbed in the technology unfolding above him. Naomi stood beside him quietly, her hand resting gently on his shoulder as the drone circled overhead. She did not notice Alexander descending the staircase behind them until he stopped several steps away, his presence quiet but unmistakable. Naomi turned slightly and saw him standing there among the small group of spectators watching the demonstration. Their eyes met again for a brief moment. Alexander did not interrupt the demonstration or approach the boy immediately. Instead, he simply observed Elijah with a thoughtful expression, the weight of realization still settling within him. When the drone demonstration ended, Elijah turned excitedly toward Naomi, speaking quickly about how the sensors stabilized the aircraft during flight. As he talked, he noticed Alexander standing nearby and looked up curiously. "Mom," Elijah asked quietly, "is that man part of the conference too?" Naomi followed his gaze and met Alexander's eyes once more. For several seconds, the three of them remained still within the busy exhibition hall while attendees continued moving around them, discussing technology and logistics models. Naomi knelt slightly, so her face was level with Elijah's. Her voice remained calm and gentle. "Yes," she said softly. "He works in the same industry that Mom does." Elijah nodded politely before looking back at the drone display with renewed interest. Naomi stood again and faced Alexander with the same composed confidence she had carried since the moment they reunited in the lounge. Alexander's voice was quieter than it had ever been during their years together. "He is remarkable," he said, glancing briefly toward Elijah. Naomi's expression softened slightly, but remained steady. "He is curious about everything." Alexander nodded slowly, acknowledging the simple truth in her words. The three of them stood together in silence for a moment while the summit continued around them. Naomi finally placed a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder. "We should head home soon," she said kindly. Elijah agreed with a small nod, still thinking about the drones he had just watched fly above the stage. Naomi looked back at Alexander one final time before speaking. "Take care of yourself, Alexander." Her tone carried neither anger nor bitterness, only quiet closure. Then she guided Elijah toward the exit of the exhibition hall, the sound of their footsteps fading gradually into the larger rhythm of the convention center. Alexander remained standing where he was, watching them walk away through the crowd until they disappeared beyond the glass doors leading toward the street outside. The afternoon. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of the atrium, reflecting across the polished floor where attendees continued discussing innovation and logistic strategies for the future. Yet Alexander Grant understood with sudden clarity that the most important future he had once been offered had walked out of his life years ago, carried forward by the quiet strength of the woman who had refused to abandon the life he once rejected.